pleasure to be back in the CJJ space as the former National Youth Chair and member of my own SAG several years back. It actually feels good to be in this space and acknowledge that we're having this conversation about closing youth prisons and reimagining a world without them. And so I really want to take a moment again to just say that this is a new space to be in and a new conversation that is being had. And I'm just proud to be here surrounded by colleagues, friends, comrades in this fight. And so you all have their bios in your conference packets, and so I'm not going to waste time with the bios, but I will just lay them out very quickly. So we have Lacey, who is Director of the DC Department of Youth and Rehabilitation Services. We have Valerie Slater, who is Executive Director of Rise for Youth, and Krystal Seruya, who is the youth member for Youth for Justice New Jersey, and also at New Jersey Youth Advocate Programs. And so I'm going to kick this off really quickly and try to get us into some really deep conversations around why we need a new vision for youth justice. And so we really want to think about that intentionally, and I want to kick it off to Clinton with that particular question. You know, we're talking about what Jeff Sesky said is a new vision, a new model that moves us away from youth prisons. And so I'd really like for you to kick us off with that as someone who leads this system right now, and let us know why. Why do we need a new vision for youth justice?
Thank you, and thank you so much. And it's a pleasure and honor to have the opportunity to be here with such an esteemed audience of justice leaders around the country, and certainly inspired more than I was when I walked in the door to see your faces, to see such a huge room, and to be on the panel with my distinguished colleagues here, and of course listening to the judge's charge and inspirational words. I think he said it best in terms of answering your question around why we need a new vision for youth justice. I think it's back to something very basic and fundamental about what children need, right? All young people, even those who have found themselves or have wandered into or have fallen into or have walked into trouble, right? Even those who have caused harm, even those who many of us are still afraid of, that all of our young people still need the same fundamental things. At the department in DC, we've decided and we've said and are trying to live up to our words that we're building our work on a foundation of love. Now, love isn't a word that's usually used in juvenile justice circles or in justice circles, at least not enough. But hopefully it will continue not just to be spoken, but that we would challenge ourselves to begin to figure out, as we say, what does love look like? How do we translate compassion, care, unconditional commitment, providing children what we would want for our own children? God forbid if they were inside of the system or in detention, right, or otherwise impacted by the system. How do we translate that value system, that intent, into our actual policies and our practices? And to do that, clearly we need a new vision. Clearly, the old model, the roots of juvenile justice in this nation, we know what those roots are. We know that the system that grew out of the context of this nation's history grew out of racism, slavery, marginalization. If we're talking about native populations, if we're talking about African Americans, if we're talking about immigrant populations, if we're talking about poor marginalized white kids, right? If we're talking about people on the margins, we know that our system grew out of that and has never been what it needs to be. Clearly, over the past several years, there's been major reform efforts that have taken place, right? And many folks in this room have been part of that and making that happen. You know, various initiatives have taken place to improve our system pretty drastically, right? To move away from some of the more overtly harmful and nasty, horrible ways of treating young people. Not that it's not still taking place in our nation, we know it is. But many of the folks in this room have been part of a process to reduce numbers, right? To improve conditions of confinement, whether it be detention or deep end of the system, to think about alternatives in a different way, to try to bring services to young people involved in the system. But I think that, unfortunately, the reform effort has run into what I consider to be an identity crisis. one in which systems, even those who are on a pathway of reform, still define themselves, their agencies, their staff, their apparatus as the people and the place and the source of the answer.
Yeah.
But there's a major missing ingredient in that process, and that's the voices of the youth, the families, and the communities that are most impacted.
Yes.
So a new vision goes beyond becoming a kinder system, a more gentle system, even a smarter system with evidence-based practices and various ways of bringing cognitive behavioral therapeutic interventions and our various things that we are ramping up our staff and training our people in. Not to say we shouldn't have a highly trained and excellent staff, but all of those things are extremely limited in their ultimate impact if they are not put in a context of partnering with and building the capacity of the village that we all say it takes to raise our children.
Yeah.
The village isn't the system. We may be a part of that and should be a positive contributing partner in building the village's capacity, but ultimately our children, as the judge said, are going home. And they live in an ecosystem. They have a family. They have a neighborhood. They have a context. If our vision for youth justice isn't primarily focused on partnering with and building the capacity of the village to care for and love its children, then what in fact are we really doing? Mm-hmm. And what is the sustainability of our young people's opportunities to succeed in their homes? We're not going to have or be able to, nor should we, implement some sort of process where we're going to airlift all of our children out of their quote-unquote horrible communities, right? That's still part of our rhetoric, right? He's not a bad kid. He just comes from a bad neighborhood, right? It's not the kids, it's the parents, right? This is still the rhetoric. And translated into the practice and the policies of our systems. So the new vision turns that on its head and says, no, within the very communities, within the families, within that ecosystem, there are assets, there are strengths, there are huge challenges, and we're not going to delude ourselves into thinking that there aren't. But we're going to define our role as investors in villages, as capacity builders, as partners. And with that new vision, then, I think that drastically changes our decisions about what we do with young people, where they go, where we put them, why our inclination to place them out of home, to put them in locked facilities, and many other decisions that we know have harmful effects on our kids. So I think that's the overall sort of base and foundation of a new vision. It is to redefine our identity. It's as has been said for many years, it's not the kids' behavior, it's our behavior that's ultimately going to be most important. So who do we think we are? Literally, right?
And I would just agree. I would very firmly agree that, you know, we are a room full of what folks would say are experts, right? And I know that I work with some of the most amazing experts, and they're between the ages of 14 and 24. And many of them have had system involvement. And when they bring their truth to the table, when they bring their lived experiences to the table, and we're able to partner that with what Clinton said, you know, the systems and other players, those that are making decisions. When decision makers begin listening to the experts of impacted community, wow, your decisions become so much more powerful, right? Because you get the buy-in of that community that you're impacting. You get the buy-in of the young people. You know, most recently we created a documentary video just kind of talking about the work that our young folks are doing. And one of our young ones says, you know, those decision makers, they're listening to us. And the decisions that are being made, they reflect our voice. It made me feel good. It made me feel like, yeah, I got a voice for a change. So I'm just going to echo what you said.
I just want to add that I have a vision that we actually see children for being what they actually are, children. I have a vision that we allow youth to utilize their voice because, like Valerie said, they are the experts at this. I have a vision that we will no longer put youth behind bars and minimize their voice and make them feel alone and insecure and like they have no type of safety within a facility that's supposed to be there to rehabilitate them, right? I have a vision that we move away from this correctional officer kind of mindset and more into counseling, social work kind of role with mental health services that are actually dedicated to the youth and that are actually going to help them and really truly rehabilitate them. All right, our system, especially in New Jersey, it's not working. Over 70% of the youth who go into a youth prison reoffend within 3 years. The numbers say it right there that it's not working. We need to move to a different model. We need to move to putting youth in their communities. Instead of spending $289,000 for 1 year for one kid, we need to invest that back into the community, back into their education, back into their house, back into their home. You know, it always is really outstanding how we invest more to lock up a youth in a youth prison for 1 year than you actually invest in my public education.
Youth has actually managed to push through the closure of a facility and succeeded. And now we're at a point where Virginia is actually trying to look at what that new vision is for Virginia. Could you just give us maybe a few thoughts on that, what it actually looks like, what that new vision might look like in Virginia?
So what Quentin just laid out, that's exactly what we're asking for. We're asking first and foremost that every dollar that you intend to spend, put it into the communities where young folks are actually coming from. If you can lay out, well, you know what, these kids are coming from particular zip codes, and we can lay out exactly what's going on in those communities, and I mean, those kids, they just got it rough. Well, if those kids and those families have it rough, where best to place every dollar? And we're not even saying that every dollar's got to come from the Department of Juvenile Justice. We're saying that DJJ's got to do their share, DSS has got to do their share, education's got to do their share, and the state and the local governments have got to do their share. But when you bring all of those monies and all of those resources together, and you place right dead center in the planning process, those families, those young people that are constantly kind of on that revolving wheel of system involvement, and I mean, yeah, DJJ's got their portion in it, right? But then there's that DSS revolving wheel, and there's that education wheel that's, you know, putting them out and then letting them back in, and then putting them in alternative, and then, I mean, we could just go on, right? But what if all of those players came to the table with the impacted community and said, what we're going to build is an ecosystem, a haven of safety and support. And if we did that, I mean, when we start talking about what does it look like, that securest place for those young people that have caused or contributed to the greatest harm, what if that was the impetus for change? What if that was the first place that we considered and built out in the center of community? And then everything that those kids would need, their families would need to be supported. What if it didn't just support those kids? What if it supported the entire community? What if all of those resources became a part of the ecosystem that the community used to heal and to build and to grow? That's what we're pushing for in Virginia. We're pushing for all of the dollars, every dollar, that goes to support the young ones that are on whatever treadmill, whatever cycle, that all of those dollars would support every family member, every struggling young person, every school system that's struggling, and ultimately, seriously, we could see communities turn themselves around. We know what disenfranchisement can do. We know what under-resourced communities. We know that there is still, folks find a way, right? It may be by an alternative means, but folks find a way to meet their needs. What if you gave them resources and they were able to do it? And we stopped criminalizing communities that are just trying to make it, and instead resource them.
You know, our vision of closing down youth prisons is to be able to take that money, as Valerie said, and invest back into community alternatives. All right, to invest back into the community that have our youth that are directly impacted, right? To open up new facilities or repurpose buildings that are already in the communities to be able to provide, services to our youth, right? In New Jersey, we already got announced closure for 2 out of our 3 youth prisons. However, right now, unfortunately, they're trying to build 3 new facilities, right? And one of the biggest fights that we have with them is, one, there's no reason to build. We can repurpose something that's already in the community, right? And 2, every time we think about building a youth prison, a juvenile detention center, it's always on the outskirts, like in the boondocks, right? It's not in the community, right? There's no way to walk to there to get there, right? And I think that that's one of the biggest problems, and we're really trying to be able to move away from that. Also, it's having our youth at the forefront of the campaign, at the forefront of this issue, and letting their voices be heard to the maximum capability, right? Let the youth tell their stories. Let the youth tell you what they actually need, because if you ever ask them, they might tell you, but the problem is we don't take the time to really find out and to really ask.
Krystal, can you elaborate a little bit more what the 150 Years is Enough campaign has been working on in New Jersey as well now, since you just spoke, and just really share with us how you've been enacting some of these changes, and or what have been some of the fights that you've been having lately in New Jersey specifically?
Yes, definitely. So I am part of the 150 Years is Enough campaign, and I specifically run the youth portions of the campaign, which is the Youth for Justice New Jersey. Follow us on Instagram. So what we've done is, so it's so much, right? So what I've specifically done is, my biggest thing is youth involvement, right? So we have gone around the state and trained youth who have been directly impacted or indirectly impacted on these issues, so that they know their rights and that they know that they have a voice, right? And through this, we have developed a team of strong youth that we take to conferences, that we invest into their personal and professional development, right? That we give them platforms for them to be able to utilize their voice. Specifically with the campaign, like I said, we got announced closure on 2 of the 3 youth prisons. Right now, we're trying to make sure that those other 3 facilities that they're talking about opening, that they're not being opened, that we're repurposing, if need be, that we're repurposing things in our community for youth to be in their actual community, right? We've created a task force in New Jersey to really try to stop the construction of these facilities and to really try to help change the mindset on what the juvenile justice system in general looks like. We have a coalition of people, of members, of organizations who are behind us, right? And we need to keep continuing to push and to gather a team even bigger than what's in this room today, and we all need to be on the same page and understand that youth prisons do not work. What works is community alternatives. What works is mental health services. What works is investing in the youth's education, giving them experience, giving them exposures. You don't know how many times I have a youth, in Newark, which is the 2nd highest city that's sending our youth to youth prisons, and they've never been out of their community. Never. So if they've never seen something different, what can we expect? So us as adult partners, we need to be able to provide youth with different experiences. My boss, Rita, she created this continuum of care, right, that basically really highlights all the resources and all the techniques and things that should be available to youth in our communities, even before they touch the system. I'm so tired of our system being reactive rather than proactive. And we really need to be able to move away from that. If we were able to implement all these resources in a youth's lives before they even touch the system, they'll be more likely not to even get into the system in the first place. But like I said, we're reactive rather than proactive. We really need to be able to move away from that model.
And we've just been speaking on the positives, really focusing on the wins that we've had and the new vision. But there have been challenges. There have been things that have literally made this movement difficult. And so I'm gonna kick it off to each of you to tell us what some of those challenges have been, and maybe you could lead us off as a system leader. What has been the challenge for the rest of the world out there?
Well, I think 2 things come to mind, and as I'm listening to the conversation, the first thing is we have some we have some questions to answer, like we do. Like those of us who are pushing for closing new prisons, pushing for a new vision, pushing really for a radical transformation. We're really talking about not, transformational work here in terms of a new vision of reimagining what a justice system is, how young people, troubled young people, how does society deal with them, right? And so what looms over us, after the conference, after the conversations, is several questions about, okay, many people can get their heads around the idea and have already gotten their heads around the idea and are doing alternatives, right? Are decreasing population, are finding ways to better serve young people, right? But what remains is the questions about, what about the ones that we're scared of, right? What about the kids who have done some things that have been seriously harmful, right, to others, to themselves? What about weapons? What about violence, right? So now that's where we start really running into the real conversation. How do you keep young people who have crossed over or have found themselves impacted on the other side of what the general public and even those in the field feel has gone too far, right? So there still is notion, it's like, yeah, but there's some of them we're gonna have to lock up, right? That's a sort of prevailing notion. And then we're left with what we have. And thankfully, some people are moving and closing these huge dungeon-like horrible institutions and building smaller, right? In DC, this was done, my predecessors had closed Oak Hill, this notorious place filled with abuse and neglect and horror stories, and opened up a 60-bed facility called New Beginnings with a state-of-the-art school and state-of-the-art recreational facilities and bicycles and animal therapy and food that you and I would eat, right? Like this place that's really based on restorative justice. And that's a great step, a major step in the movement. But what I always say, even in the institution of which I'm the director, that's not the final frontier, right? Like if we're serious about pushing ourselves and our partners to figure out how do you deinstitutionalize kids, how do you move away from locked facilities, how do you keep kids in the community, then what does that actually look like on a daily basis, right? How do I build that in my community? So at New Beginnings, we have a 60-bed facility, and we got ourselves down to 8 kids, right, in Washington, D.C. The majority of our kids are in the community, and many of those in the community were committed and or had gotten involved in some scary stuff, right? Guns, carjacking, armed robbery, right? We've even had loss of life cases, right, that weren't charged as adults, which is another conversation, of course, that connects to this. But, so how do you do that? Now, we don't, at DRS or myself, claim that we have all of the answers, but I go back to the beginning of the conversation, that the process has been about what would it take, who are the people, what are the institutions in the community, what creative type of wraparound, thoughtful process can we create to keep a young person who's done harm, to be able to either keep them or get them back to the community as soon as we can, in a way that they won't cause harm, that they won't be harmed. And that's not just a pipe dream or a philosophical conversation. It's a practical one that we have on a daily basis, because we have almost 200 kids in the community. And not all of them, but many of them in many places would have been locked up or would still be incarcerated. And so our signature effort, not to go long-winded into it, has been to really put meat on the bones of this notion of investing in the community. And so our main partners are what we call credible messengers. And so they partner with our staff. They work for nonprofits, and we put our money where our mouth is, and we made budgetary decisions to decrease out-of-home placement and take money. We spent $4 million on investing in an initiative called the Credible Messenger Initiative, where we fund grassroots nonprofits to hire grassroots natural community leaders, many of whom themselves were previously inside of the system. So So we have formerly incarcerated people. We have formerly gang-involved people. We have grandmothers who have been the person on the block who feed children. We have this array of credible messages. Credible because they have the credibility with the grassroots community and credibility with the very young people that many of us have thrown up our hands to, are afraid of, think that all we can do is just incarcerate them and try to quote-unquote rehabilitate them and then feed them back to the community. So this has been not a perfect walk, but it's been a very successful process of keeping the kids who have gotten some real trouble in the community by doing mediation with them and the people with whom they have conflict, by certainly doing CBT, by engaging in youth development practices, by doing something that the system doesn't always talk about, creating a healing community, like healing before rehabilitation. Really, I don't really like to use the word rehabilitation, right? I'd rather use the word restoration, right? Development. By creating a space, and what we've shown, and what we've proven, is that you can safely keep these kids in communities. And this is not to ignore or to wash over the fact that in some cases, some real horrible things have happened, right? That families have been impacted, that mothers are crying over their child, that there's been violence. This is not to pretend that didn't happen and say, oh, kids will be kids. This is a very direct confrontation with young people from a restorative point of view as to grappling with what they did and what happened to them and what led them to those decisions. And how can they try in some way to make amends? How can they try to restore? How can they try to repair the harm that they've done? Right? So this is not, and I'll stop speaking momentarily, but the last thing I want to say, this is what we also have to do in terms of answering these questions. We can't be painted into a corner of being quote unquote soft or weak on crime. Right? That's not what we're talking about. We want our children to be able to play in parks without getting hit by stray bullets. We want our elders to be able to walk down the street. We are passionate about community safety and public safety. What we're saying is that if we engage our young people in communities and wrap around them, engage them in that process, as opposed to relying on institutionalization, public safety will improve, not decrease. Right? But we have to, so the challenge is though, we have to be very practical and we have to have some real tangible answers to these questions. It can't just be rhetoric, right, about love, which I love to do, right? But like, okay, let's get down to it. What does it look like on a daily basis, right? But we have those answers, and collectively, right, we can come up with that. Collectively, and that means all of us in the different roles that we play. The second one challenge, and I mentioned it, is the funding. Right? And so I'm reminded of the story of the guy who robbed the banks, and they say, why do you rob banks? And he said, well, that's where they keep the money, right? So I always think about that when I think about the justice system. There's a lot of money tied up in our systems, right? So how do we free the money? How do we de-incarcerate the money and get it back to the communities? Well, it's going to take decisions by system leaders and by those of us who have impact over the flow of dollars, right? To start to rethink our sort of habitual refunding of systems and start to mandate partnerships, start to redirect money to communities that form partnerships between grassroots folks doing the work around the clock, helping young people, and those of us who are charged with running systems.